Thank you for waiting. The keynote one shall now commence. First, Mr. 宮園正隆, President of Government Pension Investment Fund, will give a speech.
こんにちは。年金積立金管理運用独立行政法人 GPIF 理事長の宮園正隆でございます。本日は TCFD サミット2021に登壇の機会をいただきまして誠にありがとうございます。GPIF は気候変動を私どもの ESG 活動の最も重要なテーマの一つと位置づけております。その一環といたしまして2018年12月には TCFD に賛同を表明いたしました。2019年からは TCFD が公表した提言に沿った気候関連財務情報の開示を行っております。本日はまずはじめに GPIF がなぜ ESG 活動に積極的に取り組むか、その背景についてご説明申し上げます。GPIF は190兆円を超える年金積立金を国民の皆様からお預かりし、国内外の資本市場で運用しています。資金規模が大きいので、株式では約6000銘柄、債券で約1万5000銘柄に幅広く投資するなど、世界の資本市場全体に幅広く分散投資している投資家でございます。市場ではユニバーサルオーナーと呼ばれております。また GPIF が運用する年金積立金は100年という長期間の財政計画をもとに設計されました日本の公的年金制度の中で、数十年先の未来における現役世代の保険料負担が大きくなりすぎないように使われるものであります。その意味で GPIF はいわば世代をまたぐ長期投資家ということも言えると思います。このような2つの特質を持つ GPIF が長期にわたって安定した投資収益を獲得するためには、投資先個々の企業価値が長期的に高まり、ひいては資本市場全体が持続的安定的に成長することが何よりも大切です。そして資本市場は長期で見ると環境問題や社会問題、ガバナンスの影響から逃れられないので、こうした問題が資本市場に与える負の影響を減らすことが投資収益を持続的に追求する上で、そして被預権者である国民の利益のために不可欠であると考えております。これが GPIF が ESG 活動に積極的に取り組む背景でございます。さて、さまざまな ESG 活動の ESG 課題の中でも、気候変動に伴うリスクについては影響の大小はあるものの、すべての資産クラスに、そしてすべての銘柄に同時に生じるものでございまして、私どものようなアセットオーナーにとっては分散投資を行っても完全に消すことのできないリスクです。また少なくとも長期的には顕在化する可能性が極めて高いリスクであるという考えが世界の共通した認識であります。GPIF ではこのような特質を持つ気候変動リスクに関しては、アセットオーナーが主体的に取り組むべき課題であると考えて、TCFD への賛同をはじめとした活動を行っております。GPIF がこのほど行った2020年度版の TCFD 開示におきまして、温室効果ガス排出に関する分析の対象をスコープ3まで拡大し、初めてサプライチェーン全体をカバーいたしました。また分析対象資産についても新たにオルタナティブ資産の一部、具体的には国内不動産について 初めて分析の対象といたしました。さらには低炭素社会への移行に伴う機会とリスクの産業間移転の分析を新たに行いました。本分析では特にエネルギー産業や化学産業においては脱炭素社会への移行に伴う機会がリスクを大きく上回り、我が国にはこれらの産業において有望な技術があることが分析から明らかになりました。この TCFD 開示は私どもの2020年度版の ESG 活動報告およびその別冊として GPIF のホームページに公表しておりますのでご覧いただければ幸いでございます。さて、気候変動リスク機会に関する情報は従来は非財務情報であったのが今や株主価値に直結する財務情報に変化するフェーズを迎えています。一方で気候変動が将来の企業価値や産業構造に与える影響を適切に捉えるまでにはさらなる分析の改善の余地も多く残されております。GPIF は超長期投資家として分析の改善に腰を据えて取り組んでまいりたいと考えております。GPIF は自らが気候関連財務情報をはじめとする ESG 情報の開示拡充に取り組むことを通じて市場全体の持続可能性の向上に努めてまいる所存でございます。今回の TCFD サミットがインベストメントチェーンを構成するさまざまな参加者による活動のさらなる活性化につながりますようお祈り申し上げます。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Next, Mr. Ronaldo O'Hanley, Chairman and CEO of State Street Corporation, will also give a speech.
Hello, my name is Ron O'Hanley, and I am Chairman and CEO of State Street. I am honored to be with you today, and I would like to thank the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, as well as the TCFD Consortium and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for convening this summit. We praise Japan's leadership for its urging of companies to provide more transparency around how the companies manage financial risk posed by climate change. Since last year's TCFD Summit, we have seen significant progress in the endorsement and adoption of the TCFD framework. After the G7 summit last June, the Group of Seven released a directive supporting mandatory climate-related financial disclosures based on existing recommendations from the TCFD. The G7's backing shows growing recognition and acceptance that climate risk is financial risk and that climate risk disclosures are critical for managing those risks. In July, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors committed to developing a baseline global reporting standard building on the TCFD framework and taking into account regional circumstances. TCFD disclosures are an emerging requirement for all parts of the financial system, including pension funds, banks, and insurers. We are shifting from TCFD as a voluntary disclosure framework to it becoming a primary regulatory response to climate risk. So far, New Zealand, the UK, Hong Kong, Switzerland, and Canada have announced new implementation plans around mandatory TCFD reporting. It has been less than 6 years since the Financial Stability Board created the TCFD, and already climate risk disclosures are becoming the norm in economies representing over 80% of global GDP. At State Street, we endorse TCFD principles as a strong investor-led framework for reporting on climate change risk. In 2017, we committed to adopting those principles to report on our own management of climate change risk. In 2018, State Street Global Advisors, our asset management division, began asking portfolio companies to disclose climate risk using the TCFD framework. State Street engages with listed companies on issues that are material to a company's ability to generate long-term value, and climate change is one of our most urgent and material risks. We are pleased with the progress in TCFD endorsement. The next step will be TCFD implementation, as companies find ways to overcome the challenges to gathering data across their operations. We are committed to helping companies adopt and implement TCFD disclosures. We do not believe in a one-size-fits-all approach, but we will assist in sharing industry best practices. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak about one of our generation's biggest challenges. Together, we can build a stronger and more sustainable world.
Thank you very much. Now, we would like to move on to panel discussion 1, Asset Owners' Role in Today's TCFD Disclosure Landscape. The facilitator of this session is Mr. Mizuno Hiromichi, Special Envoy of UN Secretary General on Innovative Finance and Sustainable Investment. Now, I'd like to pass the facilitation to Mr. Mizuno.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the third TCFD Summit. This is one of the conferences which is really focusing on the TCFD recommendation, and also the provided very useful opportunities for participants as a panelist or speaker, as well as an audience, to up to the speed of development in the area of sustainable finance. And I'm very honored to be a moderator of the first panel together with these distinguished panelists. The theme is about the asset owner's role in the sustainable investment, but I think we really cannot talk how and what the asset owners should do separately from what the other actors and actresses of investment chain trying to reshape our capital market. So today, I'm really pleased to have the four distinguished panelists. Let me just introduce from, hi, Marcy in the virtual form. So the first the panelist is Marcy Frost. She's CEO of CalPERS, California Pension Fund. And next to her is Mr. Akira Sugano, President and CEO of Asset Management One. And then Edward Baker, Head of Climate Policy from PRI, Principle for Responsible Investment. And the farthest end is the Kazuyuki Shigemoto, Executive Officer, Chief General Manager in Investment at the Dai-ichi Life Insurance. So I'm glad to have you all on the panel. So let me start with the, first of all, set the sort of like the backdrop or background of our discussion, because as I said, this is the third TCFD Summit. And this is the one forum which is the METI and the TCFD Consortium trying to bring the global intelligence to Tokyo to discuss the sort of like the recent and the latest development of TCFD movement. But today we just wanted to start with what happened to your organization, or what is, was the development happened after the last TCFD Summit. Just to draw the background, since the last TCFD Summit, there are several major movements in the world. One is including Japanese government. Many the countries made the net zero commitment. And then also following those national commitments, there are a lot of private sector initiatives set up, like the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, and Race to Zero, and etc. And I'm very happy to have Dai-ichi Life and the Asset Management who are major participants of those initiatives. And then the last one is, as the other keynote speaker mentioned about, this in several countries, there's a development of making the TCFD disclosure mandatory. And Ron didn't mention about the Japan, but the Japan also the revised corporate governance code to make it effectively mandatory for prime market listed companies to do a TCFD disclosure. So reflecting those, I just wanted to go around the panelists so that you could share the development have you made since the last TCFD Summit in terms of, particularly if you can make some specific commitment you made. So shall I start with Marcy?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to take just a moment to recognize Japan's leadership in setting the 2050 net zero goal for reducing climate emissions. So we recognize that commitment and certainly appreciate it. I was very honored to be a part of this program last year, and I'll just get to some of the key steps that we have been taking, primarily in our channel called Climate Action 100+. So last year we did publish our first TCFD report in response to the TCFD recommendations. This did set out our investment strategy on climate change, which focuses on both the risks and the opportunities that we see across the portfolio. So an update is that we are in the process of refreshing this report, and it'll dive into the 3 channels of our investment strategy on climate change, which is advocacy, engagement, and integration. And partnership, of course, is the foundation of that strategy. But I would like to take just a moment to highlight the progress of the initiative, Climate Action 100+, that many of us are a part of. CalPERS did convene and co-found this investor-led initiative to ensure the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take necessary action on climate change. To date, we have more than 615 investors with 55 trillion in assets, engaging with about 167 companies that account for 80% of the global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. Together, we are driving significant change. Bloomberg New Energy Finance recently assessed that Climate Action 100+ companies and found that as of August of this year, 111 of those companies have now set a net zero target. Combined emission reductions of these companies equate to 9.8 billion metric tons by 2050. And the magnitude of that is significant. Not only does it represent a quarter of today's global greenhouse gas emissions, it's nearly equivalent to China's annual emissions. So to chart progress, another development that's happened within the last year is what we call the Net Zero Company Benchmark for Climate Action 100+, which sets out those timelines for short, medium, and long-term emissions reductions. And those are alignment of CapEx, incentives, and political lobbying. We've developed a new indicator to ensure a just transition, to ensure the impact on workers and communities forms part of the company's strategies as well towards those net zero targets. We're working with the Vatican Council on Inclusive Capitalism, and here I know you have been a part of that as well, to build out the work on the just transition.
Thank you, Marcy. So I definitely will come back to you to discuss the index a bit more in detail, but let me just ask the Sugano-san to share your view and your experience.
Okay, thank you, Mizuno-san. Asset Management One is one of the largest asset managers in Asia with asset under management of 57 trillion yen. It's almost equal to 510 billion US dollar. And after the last TCFD Summit into 2020, we decided to participate in the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which is followed by many asset managers. So we were one of the founding members of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, and we have been acting as board advisory member to the steering committee since then. And one of the reasons why we decided to jump into this initiative is that we have been discussing how to integrate materiality into every aspect of management, including asset investment. So we came up with drawing a materiality map, which is double materiality. And of course, social impact and economic impact. On the top right-hand side, there is climate change. So that's one of the reasons within very short period of time, we decided to make a commitment to Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. And the first group of asset managers were studied, and then it grew in numbers. And this year, July, the number grew to 128, with asset under management of 43 trillion US dollar, which is almost 40% of the total global asset under management. So it's a quite big, huge chunk of asset managers gathering for this cause. The first thing which we did is to jump into the initiative. The second thing is to make a commitment clear. So last month, we made it clear that we are going to make our asset under management to be aligned with net zero by 2030. The percentage of the total asset of asset under management is 53%, which is equal to 30 trillion yen. It's 270 billion US dollar. So by 2030, we are going to make our asset under management to be aligned, 53% of our asset under management to be aligned with net zero initiative. We are going to use Paris aligned investment initiative to calculate the percentage of the assets. So we are following that. And I think that is one of the earliest declaration of interim target by participants in the initiative. The other thing which we did is to call on other Japanese asset managers. Because I said that 128 asset managers participated, but only 3 are Japanese asset managers. So it's quite small portion of the total. So we means asset management one, and Nissay Asset Management and Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, we were the signatory of the initiative, and we called on other Japanese asset managers to come in. So we kind of drummed up support for the initiative. We didn't hear any response yet, but I think that kind of continuous engagement with our peer asset managers is quite important.
Thank you very much. I particularly appreciate your advocacy for net zero movement because I'm working together with Mark Carney. We are peer UN Special Envoy to promote the Glasgow Net Zero Finance Alliance, the Net Zero Alliance. And that's going to be a big alliance of all the different alliances, including asset managers and asset owners. And definitely would like to hear from Shigemoto-san about your experience related to net zero asset owner. But maybe before, I just want to go to Edward to talk about the, from PRI's perspective, because the PRI has been leading all these like a discussion on a framework, and I was on a board, and one of the biggest topic always at the PRI was how to standardize the disclosure matrix. So obviously we saw the big hope when the TCFD was established. But I would like to ask Edward to share what's happening at the policy, the discussion level. Maybe I think the PRI is a great, the organization. You are in a position to share that with the audience and the other panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Hiro. And I just may start by sort echoing the comments that Martin made earlier about recognizing Japan's leadership in this area, and also your personal leadership and the work of the TCFD Forum. I think it's very important to the success of TCFD in going global in the move that Japan has made. So I am obviously slightly the odd one out on this panel. I am representing our CEO, who unfortunately can't be here today. But I think, as you rightly said, Hiro, this year is an extremely important year for climate-related disclosure. This is not a new concept, of course. It's been around for many years. But there's no doubt that this year will be a breakthrough year. And I think the TCFD has been integral to that. I think the fact that it has been industry-led has had that credibility in terms of initial market take-up. It has this sort of flexibility, which means can be adopted in both markets that have had regulatory frameworks in place for a number of years, and also those that are perhaps sort of new to this. So I think a major development really over on a year from last year has been, I think, just clarity in the direction of where we are going. So a year ago, it was some uncertainty as to whether there was going to be consolidation or fragmentation, or maybe consolidated fragmentation between the different disclosure regimes around the world. But now I think, thanks really to the work of countries like Japan and the COP26 unit, which Mark Carney has been leading, I think there really is an exciting opportunity for standardization. And this, of course, is highly valued by PRI and investors to have this interoperability between regions. I think an important point, which hopefully we'll touch on later, is around some of these developments and metrics. So for PRI, I think ensuring that that there is this move to kind of a standard climate disclosure framework has been a high priority. I think we've already referenced in the G7 endorsement. We've had actually 5 countries already come out with mandatory disclosure plans, starting in some cases as soon as this year. And hopefully there will be more as we build towards the Glasgow Summit in COP. So the momentum now, I think, is unmistakable around TCFD. And at the same time, I think there's an exciting update to the task force's own guidance, which is coming, which will be important in terms of ensuring greater consistency across regions and making the disclosures that companies produce more useful to investors represented on this panel.
Thank you. So finally, Shigemoto-san, the Daiichi Life is the first Japanese asset owner to join the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which I really appreciate. So, you have been playing a significant role in the Japanese financial institution movement to push the net zero. So I'd definitely like to hear what's your experience and the new actions or commitment made from last summer.
Daiichi Life is obviously the life insurance company, and then the total asset is $600 billion. And I am responsible mainly in security investment parts. And last several years, we always put the importance on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So we tried to measure the emissions, and also that we set a scenario analysis. But we thought that we need to be more transparent, or we need global standards to the measures. So we joined February in this year to the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliances. And we declared that carbon neutral in our investment portfolio in 2050. In addition, that in a mid-term target, we declared that 25 reductions in 2025. So that's a result from the joining asset owner alliances. So I think that many financial institutions worried about many methods for the calculations or standards for that disclosures. So we joined asset owner alliances to discussing that what the right measures, and also that we join obviously TCFD to the disclosure method. And also that we join a net zero asset owner alliances, but we join also that the GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. GFANZ secretaries approached us to us because that we are the only Asian joiner for the asset owner alliances. So the GFANZ secretaries approached us to become CEO of principal groups, which is composed of the 18 global financial institutions for the GFANZ discussions. So our president, Seiji Inagaki, is a member of that CEO principal groups. And we joined the discussions, and the GFANZ now tried to proposal for the a lot of countries' government. So now we join a discussion for that. And also that Mizuno-san is then the advisor for the GFANZ. So I want to express that gratitude for the always support for our president. So that's the big movement for us.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask all of the panelists the first question, which is like, you know, we talked about some countries are making the TCFD a mandatory disclosure requirements, and at the same time, we observed, as the Edward mentioned, a lot of efforts being made to integrate all those different framework and matrix. And I have a lot of personal experience. When I talk about ESG disclosure, they ask me, okay, hundreds of them, which one to start? And I usually responded saying like, oh, for climate, maybe TCFD is going to be a core of the different disclosures. But I'm sure you are also asked the same question. So given this is the TCFD Summit to discuss particularly the TCF's role or impacts on the sustainable finance or ESG investments. So can I just go through the panel to, you know, ask that how do you respond to that kind of questions? How do you explain the significance of the TCFD in the, you know, sort of a global effort for creating a standardized matrix? So can I start with Marcy again?
Thank you. So CalPERS has about a $500 billion portfolio, and these are pension assets set aside for about 2 million members here in the state of California. But our investment strategy has data and corporate reporting as its priority, so that we know that markets rely upon a flow of reliable information to inform both our company engagement as well as our capital allocation, which is significant. These measurements and metrics need to lead to the way that capital is allocated by all of the institutional funds, including pension plans. But the TCFD has provided the foundation for that reporting on climate risk through its framework for governance and risk management, metrics and targets. We have incorporated TCFD into the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company benchmark that I referenced earlier. However, we do need to see more swift movement in this area around mandatory reporting to ensure that standardization and timely reporting, which is integrated into all of the financials. This is something that is lacking. We're a little bit agnostic to the standard that is used, but having a standard that is normalized across sectors is something that every institutional investor is seeking from the companies in which it invests. So we've advocated for this at IFRS and also in the United States at the SEC. and just recently provided input to the SEC on public comment regarding climate change disclosures. So in June, and this is available on our public website as well, we did submit a detailed comment letter supporting the mandatory climate risk reporting in the United States. Then we also have had several meetings with SEC Commissioner or Chair Gensler to set out the investment case for mandatory reporting, not just on climate risk, but other areas such as human capital management, that gives us a lot better insight into understanding the drivers of return. So we've also supported the investor agenda. Again, there are a number of these associations out there. And this is an initiative which focuses on policy measures needed to support the market's response to climate change. And then in June, as was referenced earlier in the session, G7 ministers backed mandated climate reporting in line with the recommendations of the TCFD, which we thought was a great decision and movement in this particular area. And then in July, the G20 announced supporting global implementation of the TCFD framework. And as of the 2020 status update, there are now just under 2,100 companies that support the TCFD's recommendation, including corporations with a combined market cap of about 22 trillion. And then financial institutions as well, accounting for about 178 trillion of assets under management collectively. So we've long supported mandatory climate risk reporting by the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, IFRS, through the establishment of a new body, the International Sustainability Standards for the ISSB, which will apply to the 140 markets worldwide, which allows IFRS. And I know that Japan also supports this initiative, and we're appreciative of that as well. And then also a recent update out of the European Union has set out to establish a framework of sustainability disclosure that is intended to make the EU a global leader in setting standards for sustainable finance. So the good news here is that there is a willingness in the US, in the EU, and IFRS levels to develop mandatory reporting. This will provide the financial markets with the information we need to ensure that that risk and opportunity are priced appropriately. And then we also know that private markets need to be included in climate risk reporting. To support this, we have developed the ESG data initiative with leading private equity firms and fellow investors. This was just announced last week with CalPERS and Carlyle. The initial indicators for reporting include greenhouse gas emissions and the use of renewable energy. In our real assets portfolio, we use the global real estate sustainability benchmark to gather data on climate risk and set those targets for our holdings through the energy optimization program. And then in our global fixed income portfolio, we've integrated climate risk and opportunity into the due diligence process. So in our private markets, we have about 20% of those assets that are now dedicated into what we call either clean energy, renewable energy, or through sustainable building practices such as LEED certification. So the mandatory reporting is necessary. Those measurements are important. And what that most importantly leads to is the allocation of capital in those decisions being made toward that 2050 goal.
So Sugano-san, what is your view?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to explain that the composition of our asset under management, which is over 55% in Japanese equities and Japanese fixed income. And Japanese regulators, Japanese FSA, came up with a corporate governance code which depicts that you need to use TCFD or equivalents like IFRS for the prime segment of topics. So it means that for Japanese asset manager with large exposure to Japanese domestic markets, there is no choice but to use TCFD, maybe IFRS. So I hope that the world is kind of converging toward using TCFD as a standard for approaching this net zero decarbonization approach. And I'm sure that because of the comprehensiveness of the TCFD approach, I think could be a standard in this investment management and also company disclosures.
Edward?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I think I'd just like to highlight some of the trends in TCFD reporting. I think when it first started, there was a lot of focus on governance questions and climate scenario analysis, but particularly over the last 12 months or so, increasingly focused much more on metrics and targets. And I think that's a sign of the maturity of the framework. And there have been some very important developments and discussions in the task force itself. PRI's chair is a member of the task force, and I have been supporting him on that. And I think we'll be hearing a bit later, I imagine, about some of those forthcoming reports from the TCFD itself. But I think metrics really is essential to providing these kind of disclosures with teeth. I think it really is the ability to quantify something that gets it beyond narrative disclosures that can really help drive changes in business culture and can also ultimately provide information that is useful for investment decisions. And so I think a lot of the times on climate disclosure, it's focused around greenhouse gas emission disclosure metrics. And I think this is the sort of the foundational side of things. However, there is a big F in the TCFD, and that stands for financial related disclosures. And so I think one of the things that the TCFD itself has been very focused on this year is ensuring that it's not only using proxy metrics like greenhouse gas emission metrics, but also that we get back to looking at financial disclosures. And so I think having this combination of looking at some kind of foundational elements around absolute intensity greenhouse gas emissions, looking at kind of standard approaches to transition risk, physical risk, I think is very important, but also looking at the implications for, say, CapEx and financial filings is really key, I think, to translating disclosures into something that is decision useful. So again, I'll just highlight the trend that we've seen and the greater focus on metrics is something that we welcome. I think it is still an emerging space where there is more work to be done in certain areas. But I would highlight the forthcoming report from the TCFD, the new guidance that it's putting out on a PRI. We think that this is a very important step forward and will advance globally a framework for thinking about categories of metrics, which we think will be useful for companies and investors.
Thank you. So Shigemo-san?
Yes. As an investors, we need to integrate ESG factors to our investment processes. And in that processes, we need to look at each investee company's materiality analysis or strategies for their climate change. And we have a dialogue in engagement with investee companies. And we asked for that analysis of the materiality and the strategies, and also that the countermeasures for climate change. So after that, we also asked for that investee companies to join a TCFD and disclose the result of a strategy or analysis based on the metrics of the TCFD. So also that we think TCFD now are gaining recognition from the many companies. So now it's a good time for that many companies join TCFD and disclose based on TCFDs.
So I think the important message is when somebody asks each of you whether we are not wasting time trying to do a TCFD recommendation disclosure, all of us says like, you're not wasting your time. So whatever happens, how to integrate it with the other matrix, we believe that the TCF will remain as a core framework for climate-related disclosure. I think that's a very important message for us to share with the audience. The one thing I would like to ask you is like, we talked several times about the G funds, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. That's the alliance of different alliances, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Zero Asset Manager Alliance, Net Zero Bank Alliance, Net Zero Insurance Alliance. And they are basically the two goals or purposes of that initiative, which is one to, first of all, I always say, capital market is interdependent and also interrelated. So nobody can finance a project if it's not insured. And investor cannot invest if the project is not financed. So basically there's always reaction and also interdependence. So at the Glasgow, all of those financial sector leaders, if they announce we all committed net zero scenario become the base case for any financial analysis. That's the first purpose or goal. And the second is, as I said, as capital market or financial system is so interdependent, so we just wanted to express what we need to have the other sector, private sector players to do for us to achieve our goals, right? So one thing I just wanted to go around, first of all, maybe asset owners, then the other asset manager. What do you need? What do you want the other financial players to commit for you to achieve your commitments? So maybe you want to start? Okay. So Marcy, from asset owner's perspective, what you need to see the commitment from other players, asset managers or insurance or banks. And after this, we are going to go around again to talk about what we expect from the government.
Thank you. Yeah, the commitments we are asking for through our engagement program are really the points that I've made to this date. That is, we need data, we need commitments, we need transparency around these metrics, we need it reported in a normalized way, we need it reported in a way that it can be audited. Investors are really operating, trying to figure out the risk and return opportunity that may be out there. Again, we pay $23 billion in benefits every single year, and we have a 6.8% growth assumption on the portfolio, and that's a risk-adjusted return. So our request as we engage, we need the data, we need it done in a transparent way, we need it normalized, and once we have the data, then the institutional investors like CalPERS can make those risk-informed decisions around capital allocation. And really to us, and we have a research arm of CalPERS that's getting ready to update our climate risk reporting, as well as some research around human capital and diverse managers and diversity and how that plays into better investment outcomes. But that data is extremely important because capital allocators are operating blindly without that data. So that's our request. Let's all make a decision around the framework. Let's not argue over the framework any longer. The TCFD, I love that Edward said, the big F in the TCFD. This is really about our fiduciary responsibility, the financial obligation of a system like CalPERS to understand how to allocate this capital over the long term. So that would be our request.
So Shigemo-san, why don't you just express your expectation out of the asset managers and other organizations, consist this capital market system.
Yes. As I said, that Dai-ichi Life has already joined asset owner alliances. And in asset owner alliances, we are needed to set a target in 2025. So that's 5 years earlier than the other financial industries. I personally think that the banking industry has the most influence on the market, and their target is on 2030. So because that asset owners and the banking is completely different in liquidities. So in asset owner alliances, joiner has usually securities investments. So we have liquidities more than banking industry. So I think that in a banking industries, the reduction of the greenhouse gas emission is much harder than the asset owner alliances. So I expect that commitment from the banking industry little earlier than 2030. So that's my expectation for the banking industry.
I hope somebody from the banking industry listening to this discussion. But I think you really highlighted the importance of each player have to play the role for the system to move towards the other, net zero goal. But I would like to hear from the Sugano-san, your view.
Okay, thank you. Today on this panel, we have just one asset manager and 2 asset owners. So it's I'm going to work on headwind. But so asset manager is in the middle of the investment chain. On the one side, we have asset owners like Carpas, GPIF, and Dai-ichi Life. And on the other hand, we have investee companies. So we, even though we, asset management one, declared that we are going to be net asset zero managers initiative, we cannot do that alone. We need to engage with asset owners, and we need to engage with corporate company, portfolio companies. And the difficulty in Japan is that only one asset owner joined Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and that's Dai-ichi Life. And there are many public pension funds and private pension funds. And public pension fund, GPIF, is leading the way, so I think it's okay. But for private pension funds, they are not aligned with net zero yet. They continue to focus on the financial return of the pension fund management. So we need to engage strongly with those stakeholders on the asset owner side to show how their portfolio is going to be affected by climate change with scientific evidence, or quantifying the risk-return impact relationships. And on the other hand, we need to engage with investee companies to come up with viable disclosures in accordance with TCFD or IFRS, and analyze those data. And again, with the result of the analysis, we need to go back and engage with investee companies. So we need to work both ways. So if G funds, kind of umbrella group like G funds, kind of aligning the vector of those different groups, I think asset manager's job is going to be easier.
I think the asset manager should play very important role in shifting the whole investment chain. On one hand, like asset manager is an agent, so you actually have to reflect what your clients want. But I always said anything other than ESG, asset manager always came to pitch your asset owners as clients to trying to draw their attention. So I think that now, if you really believe that the climate risk should be integrated in the portfolio construction, I think the asset manager can play a little bit more proactive role presenting the importance of the climate disclosure, climate risk integration. But the flip side of your discussion, Sugano-san, is at the moment you still feel like there is a gap between how we price investment or how the market price the stocks or bond relative to the long-term risk associated with climate change. So one of the way to solve that problem is if the whole financial market managed to price in properly climate risk and opportunities in today's market price, that gap will disappear. So to do that, what do you think is important? I think making that the TCFD disclosure mandatory is probably the contribute to that. But do you think any other thing like TCFD can play, or what we should ask the government or whoever can really push to shrink that gap?
Yes, this is my personal view. Making TCFD mandatory for government company disclosure is the first step. The second thing is that, just Mizuno mentioned that in order to incorporate the cost and opportunity, risk and opportunity of climate change into pricing. So one way to do that is carbon pricing, carbon budgeting, and there are several tools. And all the government need to bring up that unified approach toward pricing the cost and opportunities of climate change into price, valuation of the corporations. So that's the second most important step which we need to take.
I think Sugano-san touched on a very important point, which was meant to be my sort of second question to all the panelists. Because we are now 1 month from the COP26, and as all of us will be involved at the many discussions at the different level, and the momentum is building as starting with the Biden's climate summit and the G7, G20, all is moving towards the promoting more, the sustainable finance or like the TCFD or climate disclosure. But if we wanted to gather at the COP26 and we have opportunity to talk to the global leaders, what private sector should ask them to do for you, to help you to achieve net zero goals, as all of you already committed? So I think maybe I can start from the other way this time. Shigemoto-san, what do you want to ask the global political leaders to do to help your transition?
That's very difficult questions, but I think that in the actual from the point of view of investors, we always ask for that investee specific companies to join a TCFD and disclose that based on a TCFD, and also that we outsourced some investment to the asset managers. In that cases, maybe that the asset management one has already joined Asset Managers Alliance and also signed a PRI, and I think that also follow the TCFD, so that's okay. But like hedge funds or private equity or infrastructure fund managers don't sign a PRI or TCFD. But those areas are important for investment point of views. So now we started to ask for that the hedge fund managers or private equity managers to sign a PRI or TCFD and analyze that carbon dioxide emissions to their portfolios. So if the government to I personally think that it's difficult, but if the government can regulate those industries too, for that to follow the PRI or TCFDs and disclose, so that's a very helpful for that the compatibility of the each managers or each firms from the point of view of investments.
Marcy?
Thank you. I turned myself off of mute. Sorry about that. So, we do believe that there are certain things that should be done in order for CalPERS to move a little faster to 2050 with our portfolio. So financial markets need information. We certainly have talked about that today. But that's why we focus on the data and corporate reporting. Markets also need incentives to be aligned. There's a problem with misincentives. That's why we need carbon pricing, which you referenced already. And then also in the US, we need the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. And clear commitments from governments through their nationally determined contributions from the Paris Agreement also need to be set, and these need to be beyond ambition, but the planning to achieve actual net zero emissions at the latest by 2050. By 2050, we need to back into those dates. What are the goals for 2025, 2030, et cetera? So those are the things that we think need to be done. We've certainly engaged in the US, starting to engage more globally. We are making requests of the companies we're engaging with to do a TCFD report. CalPERS does a TCFD report on its portfolio. We're not asking companies to do something that we're unwilling to do ourselves. But here in the US context, it's really getting carbon priced appropriately in the market so we understand the risks, the appropriate risks, and companies are paying for the emissions, which should set a different motivation to get to net zero, and then removing those subsidies that are disincentives.
Just before going to Edward, the Marcy, you pointed out the sort of like wrong incentives, and one of the things which came to my mind when I was initially asked about the net zero alliances is, I didn't want the net zero the portfolio commitment give it an incentive to just divest some of the carbon heavy industry. So their portfolio will look like a good and the Paris compliant portfolio, but globally the issue remains, and only the ownership of the problematic company move to the people who don't care about that. So that's kind of like a long incentive I was a bit concerned about. But the what do you think? Like the Sugano-san or Shigemo-san, you joined the Net Zero Asset Owner Asset Manager Alliance. That's one of the things which concerned some people, including myself. But do you think like that Net Zero Alliance may create the wrong incentive?
I don't think so. The divestment, a few years ago, divestment is going to be only the solution to net zero. Many people say that, but the situation has changed, and now there are many investors saying that divestment is not the solution to the problem, and engagement is going to be the solution to that problem. And that's partly because of the GPIF's approach toward this issue as universal ownership. And I think we have got the idea that if we divest our polluters, then somebody else, or maybe private equity companies would buy that. That is not going to solve the problem. So we need to engage. We need to, not until the last time, to engage, give up engagement with portfolio companies. I think that's the message from Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. I don't see any line saying that you need to divest. You should divest your polluting companies from your investment, and you can achieve net zero by 2050. That is not going to be the solution. That's my understanding.
Tsuyama-san, do you have anything to add?
I agree with Mr. Sugano. So several years ago, mainly in Europe, the divestment movement had occurred. But now many investors are aware of that engagement is more important than the divestment. So as Mr. Mizuno said, that the divestment is just a change of the owners. So that's not solution of the problem. So Dai-ichi Life has a lot of dialogue for engagement with investee companies, and we asked for a lot of things based on corporate governance or stewardship code. And we are aware of that if we ask for something and the investee companies change some things, took almost 3 or 4 years. So the procedure is very long term. But I think that we just can't give up to that processes. So the 3 or 4 years engagement will make a result for the change of the investee companies.
Thank you. I'm sure that Marcy have this same opinion because the CalPERS has been leading collective engagement. So you already always emphasize the importance of engagement, right? So I really hope that your success at the Exxon and some other company as a result of a collective engagement will spread across the other asset owners. But anyway, I just sorry to keep the Edward waiting too long, but I just want to ask you because I came from the investor background, but we always regarded like as PRI is a sort of like conduit of like the policy engagement, and you are the head of the climate policy. So what is the major policy engagement point from your perspective for 2021, and if anything like you see the change in the investors, the expectation out of PRI, particularly in the area of policy engagement, I would like to hear.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ono-san. So I think probably top of mind is to ensure that high-level announcements and commitments from government translates into high level of implementation. I think a challenge for investors as you look to set net zero commitments is how to invest in an economy that's on track for 4 degrees. If your portfolio is aiming at 1.5 or below 2 degrees. And so I think there clearly is a need for a partnership between governments and the private sector. I think it's really essential that governments provide not just 2050 or 2030 announcements, but really credible emission reduction plans with robust policy frameworks that are going to drive emission changes in key sectors. And they publish these as soon as possible. So in a number of countries that we see that, for example, the power sector and the transportation sector are the most important for achieving 2030 targets. And arguably of those two, it's the power sector that matters most, because if you don't have a decarbonization of the power sector and you have mass adoption of electric vehicles, that could actually increase demand for coal or gas rather than reduce it. So I think it really is looking at the policy frameworks that are going to drive changes in the power sector in particular, and ensuring that these are brought into play. So we know that a number of conversations are underway, including, I might add, in Japan, as it looks at its own energy mix for the future. But we do think that governments need to step forward and provide credible emission reduction strategies. One thing that I just thinking to what Marcy just related, that fossil fuel subsidies affected a negative price on carbon. And back in 2009, G20 countries announced a commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Well, that was a fine commitment and an important one, but 12 years later, we're still waiting for a detailed plan as to how they're going to do it. So I think really what we need at COP is not just fine announcements, but we need credible near-term plans that will give market confidence to the direction of travel.
Thank you. So we are running out of time. To wrap up this discussion, I'd like to ask each of you, because going back to the title of this discussion, or this panel discussion, asset owners' role in the TCFD disclosure landscape. So first of all, starting with Marcy. As an asset owner, what do you think the CalPERS can do more to promote the TCFD disclosure for the benefit of all?
Well, I think one of the things that CalPERS has been doing in its private engagements with companies is, at least at this point, for those not doing the TCFD report, making that very specific request to all the listed companies. The second piece of this is that there are many unlisted companies that we also need to understand how they are managing risks associated with greenhouse gas emissions. So the work that we've been doing, GP with Carlyle, LP, CalPERS, putting together a standardized set of metrics to report out on, one, greenhouse gas emissions, and two, the use of clean energy and renewables. So this work needs to continue. We're in the beginning stages of getting this to be mandatory, at least here in the US. Again, have a lot of respect for the work that's happening in Japan, but that our government needs to make those commitments. Once the government makes commitments, companies, I think, will come along more nicely. But in the meantime, you're right, we have made a very strong policy decision that divestment does not work for CalPERS, at least in the initial stages, that engagement and keeping our voice at the table is what will work to help transition not only companies, but we also have to think about protecting vulnerable communities and vulnerable people during this transition. And we have to stay at the table, we believe, in order to have a voice in that.
Thank you. So Shigemoto-san, so the same question, what the asset owner can do to further promote TCFD disclosure?
Actually, we continue to the dialogue with our investee company in engagement. We always ask for that investee companies to sign and join a TCFD and start to disclose based on the TCFD. So we will continue that. So just we can do.
Okay, so Sugano-san, how could you help the asset owner to contribute more to TCFD disclosure?
Different questions. So we need to clarify our approach toward the investee companies on how to make climate change responses as well as portfolio return compatible, and showing that to asset owners, not only qualitative kind of scenario analysis, but quantifying the results. I say that return risk and the impact to asset owner side. So you just cannot say that you need to join net zero asset owner alliance, but you need to show some evidence, and the approach is kind of bearing fruit for your long-term asset management of the fund. So that's the way, I think.
Thank you, it's great. So Edward, what the PRI can do to assist the asset owner to play a more significant role in the net zero transition?
I think PRI, for its part, we do have an accountability mechanism when you sign up to joining the PRI, and that is a reporting framework. And so for the past 3 years, we have gradually phased in TCFD reporting requirements. I would say that I think it's important that not only that we improve the volume of reporting, but also the quality of reporting. And I think in this regard, I think PRI will be strongly supporting the new guidance from the TCFD which, as I say, is an important step forward, particularly in the advancements of looking at metrics and transition plans. From my perspective, that's something that we'd like to support. I think it will help asset owners in their conversations with their managers, as well as investing companies.
Great. So thank you very much for joining this panel. I hope we left some points for the discussion in the following panel discussion. So thank you, Edward from the UK, Europe, and thank you, Marcy from California, and thank you, Sugamo-san from Tokyo. So thank you very much for listening to this panel discussion. I hope the following discussion will be very fruitful and constructive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mizuno, and the panelists. Thank you very much for your discussion. Next session is Keynote 2 and the panel discussion 2. Participants online, please go back to the timeline and join the next session. We will begin shortly. Please wait for a while. Thank you. The keynote 2 will now commence. First, Mr. Tokura Masakazu, Chairman of Keidanren, will give a speech.
Keidanren会長の徳倉です。第3回 TCFD サミットの開催に心からお祝い申し上げます。さて、経団連は昨年、新たな成長戦略を公表し、サステイナブルな資本主義の確立を掲げました。現在、これを目指し、さまざまな活動を展開しております。サステイナブルな資本主義に向けては、グリーン成長の実現が重要となります。すなわち、気候変動対策に 積極的に取り組むとともに、これを経済成長につなげ、経済社会の根底からの変革であるグリーントランスフォーメーション DX を目指す必要があると考えております。こうした認識のもと、経団連は気候変動問題に対して主体的取り組みを進めております。とりわけカーボンニュートラルの実現にはイノベーションが不可欠でありますことから、企業のイノベーションへの挑戦を後押しするプロジェクトチャレンジゼロを強力に推進しています。チャレンジゼロに参加する企業団体は、まずカーボンニュートラルの実現に貢献するイノベーションへの挑戦を宣言いたします。その上で、それぞれが挑戦する革新的技術開発、社会実装普及、ファイナンスに関する具体的なアクションを公表します。現在、180を超える企業団体から390以上の野心的なチャレンジを表明いただいております。ご案内のとおり、日本政府は昨年の TCFD サミットにおいて、チャレンジゼロと連携したゼロエミチャレンジを立ち上げており、本日その第2弾が公表されました。このゼロエミチャレンジは、カーボンニュートラルに挑戦する企業の情報を国内外の ESG 投資家等に向けて発信する非常に有益なプロジェクトですので、ぜひご活用いただければと存じます。また、企業によるカーボンニュートラルへの挑戦を金融面からサポートする環境整備も非常に重要であります。現在、サステイナブルファイナンスのインフラともいえる TCFD 提言について、日本の賛同機関数は世界一であり、特に製造業など金融機関以外の企業の占める割合が多い点が特徴であります。このことは日本の産業界が気候変動開示の重要性を強く認識している表れと考えます。さらに来年、東京証券取引所は市場区分を再編しますが、グローバルに活動を行う企業が中心となるプライム市場におきましては、上場規則におきまして TCFD 開示が求められる予定であります。経団連といたしましても、TCFD 開示企業のさらなる裾野の拡大や、金融機関、投資家とのエンゲージメントの進化などに積極的に取り組んでまいります。無論、カーボンニュートラルは一足飛びには実現できず、その移行期において不可欠となるトランジション技術に対しても資金を動員することが重要です。そこで日本政府はトランジションファイナンスに関する基本指針を今年5月に策定し、現在これに基づく業種別労働マップの検討作業を進めております。経済界としてもこうした議論に積極的に参画するとともに、アジアなどの途上国、新興国に対してもトランジションファイナンスの重要性を積極的に発信してまいります。地球規模の排出削減を進める上では、企業は自らの事業活動のみならず、いわゆるスコープ3と呼ばれるバリューチェーン全体での削減にも取り組んでいかなければなりません。経団連は多様な製品サービスにおけるグローバルバリューチェーンを通じた削減貢献量を算定し、コンセプトブックとして取りまとめ、世界に発信しております。ESG 投資家の皆様には、こうした日本企業の貢献につきましても、ぜひ着目をいただければと考えております。最後となりますが、本日のサミットを通じまして、気候変動対策に積極的に取り組む企業と ESG 投資家との相互理解が一層深まることを大いに期待しております。ご清聴どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you. Next, Mr. Yamaji Hiromi, President and CEO of Tokyo Stock Exchange, will give a speech.
Hello, everyone. This is Hiromi Yamaji from Tokyo Stock Exchange. It's fantastic to see the TCFD Summit being held for the third time this year. I have liked to see you all in person, but considering the current situation, this is the best way to send my message. I'd like to give a big thank you to all of those who have made this summit possible. 2021 was a year in which action and disclosure based on the TCFD recommendations were given a huge push forward in Japan. The Japanese Corporate Governance Code, which we revised this year, now strongly stresses to companies the importance of action on sustainability issues. On the topic of climate change in particular, it asks that all listed companies should address climate change positively and proactively to increase corporate value over the mid to long term. But on top of that, for companies listed on the new prime market, which we are launching next year, the code requests that they should analyze data on the impact of climate change risks and opportunities on their business activities and profits, and enhance the quality and quantity of disclosure based on the TCFD recommendations or an equivalent framework. In Japan, the number of companies and organizations which have announced support for TCFD is growing, but there are still issues when it comes to putting the recommendations into practice in a company's activities and disclosure, and we are aware that a lot of companies are finding this difficult. Japan Exchange Group is working hard to provide information to help more listed companies and investors to use TCFD effectively. Every fiscal year since 2018, JPX and the Financial Services Agency have jointly held outreach events on the theme of TCFD with the aim of deepening investors' and companies' understanding of the importance of information disclosure and dialogue using the TCFD recommendations. In addition to this, JPX introduces TCFD as one of the main disclosure framework that companies can use in its practical handbook for ESG disclosure, which is created for listed companies, and the information portal site, JPX ESG Knowledge Hub. These two resources provide information that companies can refer to when preparing disclosure based on TCFD. Recently, many countries and regions, including Japan, have pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In order to reach this target, countries, regions, international organizations, companies, investors, NGOs, and others are working towards mitigation and adaptation to climate change. But one thing which will be key to these goals is capital. Fighting climate change will require a huge amount of capital. For example, the International Energy Agency estimated in a report this year that $5 trillion of investment could be needed annually by 2030 in order to achieve net zero, and that is just in the energy sector. The financial industry has an extremely important role to play here. In this way, it will be vital for company disclosure on climate change to progress, making use of TCFD, and for that disclosed information to be used by investors in their company evaluations so that capital can be allocated to companies which are taking the lead on fighting climate change, the transition to a low-carbon economy, and innovative technologies. Today's TCFD Summit has brought together people with a large range of perspectives from all over the world, and I am looking forward to robust debate on how to achieve wider adoption and implementation of the TCFD recommendations. My hope is that today's discussions can become a tailwind for the further adoption and traction of TCFD around the world and the creation of the virtuous cycle of environment and growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we would like to move on to panel discussion 2, efforts to improve the quality of TCFD disclosure. The facilitator of this session is Mr. Nagamura Masaki, Fellow International Initiatives at Tokyo Marine Holdings Inc. Now I would like to pass the facilitation to Mr. Nagamura. Mr. Nagamura, please.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the second panel of the TCFD Summit 2021. My name is Masaki Nagamura, Fellow for International Initiatives at Tokyo Marine Holdings, a member of the TCFD, and a steering committee member of the TCFD Consortium. It is such a great honor to facilitate this session that focuses on efforts to improve the quality of TCFD disclosure. It aims at shedding light on the new developments that have taken place at or around TCFD and help you find out how you should be prepared for the anticipated changes, not only in the TCFD's guidance, but the landscape of sustainability disclosure standard setting. We are fortunate to have 4 experts with firsthand knowledge of disclosure practices lined up as panelists. Let me introduce you one by one. Participating from New York, we have Ms. Becky Swanson. Becky is a senior consultant at Oliver Wyman and serves as a member of the TCFD Secretariat. Thank you, Becky, for calling in at 2 a.m. New York time. Then we have Ms. Megumu Tsuda, Deputy General Manager at Sustainability Promotion Department of Hitachi Limited in Japan. Thank you, Tsuda-san, for participating. Really appreciate it. Then we have Mr. Satoshi Ikeda, Chief Sustainable Finance Officer of the Financial Services Agency of Japan, and he is participating online. The 4th panelist is Mr. Yasunori Iwanaga, Managing Director at Amundi Japan. It is such a pleasure to have you all on board. Now, before I start asking each panelist to share their views, let me show you a number of slides that summarize the recent developments that have taken place around climate-related disclosures. There's a growing number of countries or regions that have declared to make climate-related disclosure a mandatory practice, such as the EU, the UK, and New Zealand. Although the US is not there yet, the US Securities and Exchange Commission requested public input on climate-related disclosure between March and June of this year. I think it is fair to assume that the Commission is working on making some kind of rules on the subject. Now, many speakers have already touched upon what's happening in Japan. The TCFD's recommendations were developed as a voluntary framework, but it turns out that many jurisdictions are referring to the framework as a tool for mandatory disclosure. Now, there's a strong demand to improve consistency and comparability of climate disclosures, and standard setters are working towards convergence and standardization. The proposed establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board under the auspices of the IFRS Foundation is capturing the attention of many. The ISSB is expected to be launched in advance of COP26, and climate appears to be the first focus of its work. A group of 5 leading ESG standard setters already published last December the prototype climate-related financial disclosure standard, which was developed from the TCFD framework. The prototype is undergoing further refinement, which will eventually be fed into the work of the ISSB once launched. This is to touch briefly on the new report, which has just been published today by the TCFD Consortium of Japan. The report is titled Green Investment Guidance 2.0, which is a renewed version of its predecessor released 2 years ago. The report covers contemporary topics such as carbon neutrality by 2050, transition finance, internal carbon pricing, and how financial institutions are working on climate scenarios published by NGFS. It also discusses investors' interest in Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and even beyond, that is, emissions throughout a product's life cycle, a concept which is also known as avoided greenhouse gas emissions. The report is a good reading, not only for investors and financial institutions, but also for non-financial businesses to better understand the perspectives of investors and lenders. This should help data preparers understand what constitutes a decision-useful disclosure, which is hopeful to enhance the quality of disclosure. That is all from me. Now, let me turn to the panelists and solicit their views on the changing landscape of climate-related disclosures. I would like to start with Ikeda-san from the FSA. Ikeda-san, would you tell us the background and goals behind making climate-related disclosures practically mandatory in Japan? If you could start with a quick self-introduction, it would be great.
Thank you, Nagamura-san. I'd be very happy to join this panel. I've been working for promoting the adoption of TCFD recommendations among Japanese corporation and financial institutions so far, and so glad to see that the third round of TCFD Summit held in Japan. Well, I am Chief Sustainable Finance Officer of the Japan FSA. Japan FSA is a capital market regulator in Japan, so we are very much responsible for designing the corporate disclosure system in Japan. And in that context, well, as the Nagamura-san said, and also the Yamaji-san from JPX Group mentioned, that now for the companies listed on the prime section of Tokyo Stock Exchange, the TCFD disclosure is mandatory. Well, TCFD recommendation started as a voluntary framework, and in adopting that recommendation in Japan, it took several years to come at this stage. The reason is that, well, first of all, we wanted that, real creativity by Japanese corporates to have a very positive dialogue with the institutional investors globally or domestically. And in that sense, we wanted to avoid certain kind of box ticking exercise of a kind of boilerplate disclosure. We wanted to that the content of the disclosure very rich. So before making it mandatory, it is very important to educate that the corporate in Japan that mainstreaming this climate issues in their business strategy and planning is very crucial, because Well, Japanese companies tend to like saying that they are doing something good for the society and the environment. But the climate issue is a systemic issue that affects the business viability of the corporate in the future. So while addressing the climate risks and opportunities are very much the corporate issue, that it's a matter of corporate value. So while creating the virtuous cycle between addressing climate challenges and achieving business growth is going to be the cornerstone of the TCFD disclosure, by which that it enables the very constructive dialogue with the global institutional investors. And as the Tokura-san mentioned, that innovation is a key to achieving carbon neutrality. And innovation is uncertain things. And we need to get financing for that certain uncertainty. And financing uncertainty will mainly come from the equity finance. And so the communication with the equity investors becomes more important in the context of addressing the climate issues. And TCFD framework is best suited for that purpose, but one question asked back then was how to do it. So we went through certain learning by doing phase and creating circumstances where the major Japanese corporations are comfortable with the going along with the TCFD recommendations. So it took 2 or 3 years, but finally, through the revision of the corporate governance code, as I said, the TCFD disclosure became mandatory. And also, further to that, we are discussing the more design of certain baseline elements of climate-related disclosure, which goes beyond the company listed on the prime section of Tokyo Stock Exchange. And that discussion is happening at the Disclosure Working Group of the Financial System Council, which usually recommends a certain policy directions vis-a-vis the financial system, which includes a corporate disclosure system to the Japan FSA. So I really see that right now, the TCFD recommendations are becoming more and more deeply rooted in the disclosure practices in Japan. And that will certainly help address the climate issue and to help reach a certain path towards the carbon neutrality. That's my perspective. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ikeda-san, for expressing your views and your expectations on how the Japanese corporates should move on from here. My take is that the revision of the corporate governance code has significant signaling effect to the market participants. And I have heard that it is not just large corporates paying attention to the revision, but also SMEs are interested because of the potential effect on themselves. So with this, let me turn to Becky. Yes, Becky is there. Just so the audience know, the TCFD members owe a lot to the Secretariat members who are working restlessly to deliver the soon-to-be finalized documents of the task force. And Becky has played an indispensable role there. Becky, my apologies for treating you so badly, for forcing you to stay up this late. But may I ask you to share with us how the expectations to the TCFD disclosures have changed and how the task force has come to revise its recommended metrics and targets. And in the meantime, requesting the portfolio alignment team to publish its technical report. Don't forget to start with a quick self-introduction.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you virtually. I'm Becky Swanson. As Mr. Nagamura mentioned, I'm a member of Oliver Wyman supporting the TCFD Secretariat. And before that, I worked for the US government on environmental policy. I wanted to start by thanking the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry for organizing this event and for all of the attendees for your work on this topic. Japan has the highest number of companies that support the TCFD of any country, which is a testament to the enthusiasm that members like Mr. Nagamura and Mr. Fujimura bring to the task force, to the work of the TCFD consortium in educating members, the Japanese government in setting clear guidelines for organizations, and Japanese companies embracing these guidelines. If I move to my first slide, in June, the task force released for consultation a proposed guidance on climate-related metrics, targets, and transition plans. This document was developed in response to requests for more guidance on metrics and targets. And the proposed guidance also addressed recent developments regarding financial organizations measuring the alignment of their activities with low carbon future, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as the disclosure of organizations' plans to transition to a low carbon economy, which my colleague Kaya Pagar will discuss in the next panel. We received robust engagement in the task force consultation with over 200 responses, 5% of which were from Japanese companies, and over 40 response letters. So thank you all for clarifying and helping refine this proposed guidance. I'm pleased to announce that the task force will be releasing the final guidance next week on October 14th evening time in Japan. One of the key aspects of the forthcoming guidance will be a set of cross-industry climate-related metric categories, such as Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and investment in low carbon opportunities that all organizations should consider disclosing. Importantly, these are not new metrics, but ones that have been part of the task force guidance since the beginning that were emphasized this year because of their importance in understanding climate-related risks and opportunities and in estimating financial impacts. The task force heard from many respondents that the proposed guidance was an important step forward, but that greater flexibility was needed given the earlier stage of reporting for some of the proposed metric categories, such as Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also important to emphasize that the task force is not a standard-setting body and encourages industries and jurisdictions to develop specific climate-related metrics to support these metric categories. Moving to the changes on climate-related targets, the biggest forthcoming change is that organizations that have set medium-term and long-term targets are encouraged to provide interim targets. This is an important request from investors, lenders, and underwriters to allow them to assess progress and has been included in many target setting frameworks already. Now, as I move to the second slide on portfolio alignment, the proposed guidance was accompanied by a technical report written by an external group on measuring the alignment of financial organizations' activities with a well below 2 degrees Celsius temperature pathway in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, portfolio alignment is a newer field, but it's growing in importance as more financial organizations make greenhouse gas emissions reduction commitments, including net zero pledges. And what's important to call out here is that portfolio alignment tools, from the perspective of the task force members' recommendations, can take a variety of forms, as shown on this slide, and each has its own benefits and drawbacks. One thing we heard strongly in the consultation responses was an emphasis that these techniques are evolving and that there was a greater request for flexibility in such disclosures, which you'll see reflected in the final guidance next week. Finally, to the question on how the expectations on TCFD disclosure are changing, this updated guidance is intended to provide more clarity and to update select items to reflect evolving considerations for climate-related disclosures, similar to the guidance that was released last year on risk management and scenario analysis. These are important updates to ensure that the TCFD guidance remains relevant, up to date, and useful as companies become more familiar with climate-related disclosures. But at the same time, the foundation of the TCFD framework remains the same. There have been no changes to the 4 recommendations or 11 recommended disclosures, and TCFD remains a voluntary framework on which regulators and others can build. And the task force also recognizes that implementation will take time as organizations become more familiar with the new guidance and as data and methodologies evolve. So I'm heartened to see the Tokyo Stock Exchange, Financial Services Agency, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, Ministry of Environment, and others continue to lead in this space and to adapt the TCFD framework in order to further define climate-related disclosures specific to the Japanese context. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Becky. Explaining what happened within TCFD over the past several months, you have confined it into 5 minutes, and that was great. That's something I could have never done. I will come back with another round of discussion, so please bear with us for another 40 minutes. As Becky mentioned, one of the key developments around the TCFD metrics and targets is its focus on Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 is not a new concept, but to make it a disclosure requirement has long been considered difficult to implement, mainly due to practical issues. I would like to ask Tsuda-san, who is with Hitachi, to let us know how Hitachi, as one of the leading Japan-based global conglomerates, is thinking of working on its complex supply chain network to achieve its commitment to hit zero emissions in 2050. Tsuda-san, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nagamura-san. Hello, everyone. I am Meg Tsuda, work in Sustainability Promotion Division of Hitachi Limited. I am very glad to be here. As Nagamura-san mentioned Hitachi as a global conglomerate, let me briefly introduce our business. Hitachi has been developing a social innovation business on a global scale to solve social issues by offering a combination of operational technology, IT, and products over its 110-year history. Its business scope covers a wide range of fields such as IT, energy, industry, mobility, life, and automotive. The company has 871 consolidated subsidiaries, of which overseas revenue account for over 50% of 8.8 trillion yen. Climate change is one of the biggest agenda for Hitachi to tackle, and also could provide a major business opportunities to realize social innovations. Under Executive Vice President Alistair Dormer, who became Chief Environmental Officer in April of this year, we aim to be carbon neutral at our offices and factories by fiscal year 2030. And we recently revised our long-term target to achieve carbon neutrality throughout the value chain by fiscal year 2050. Because Hitachi's business is centered on manufactured long-life electrical products, CO2 emissions associated with the use of sold products in Scope 3 accounts for more than 80% of total emissions. Therefore, to achieve carbon neutrality in the field, we have 3 approaches. Firstly, we provide products and services with enhanced energy-saving features. And secondly, we offer IT/OT solutions to improve efficiency through digitalization by using our digital platform, Lumada. Thirdly, we provide energy systems, facilitating the introduction of renewable energy. Regarding disclosure, we have 1,000 business sites of our own, and our procurement partners are 30,000. Therefore, it takes a lot of effort to collect and calculate data from each business unit. So CO2 emissions associated with the purchased goods and services in Scope 3 account for 9.1% of total emissions. So therefore, Hitachi Group's 30,000 procurement partners, we selected 800 companies, which account for 70% of the total transaction value, to work together first. We selected these partners by carefully examining both the scale of a procurement and the size of CO2 emissions by a procured item. So we just revised sustainable procurement guidelines in July, and we are in the process of coordinating with each company to hearing their CO2 reduction plans. We hope that we will be able to grasp the emissions of supply chain more accurately as a step toward carbon neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tsuda-san, for sharing the story. Hitachi's efforts to engage with its outsized supply chain sounds to be a valuable first step to respond to the challenge of capturing and disclosing Scope 3 emissions. Let me turn to Iwanaga-san to hear his view as an investor. Iwanaga-san, thank you for being patient. And having heard from Becky about the TCFD's newly added recommendations for financial institutions to report Scope 3 financed emissions and to align their investment or lending activities to 2 degrees or lower pathway. Could you give us how it is received by asset managers such as Amundi? I ask this because I think that there are many energy-intensive companies which are wary of the development, because if the models, such as the implied temperature rise, is used prematurely, it may lead its way to divestment. It would be great if you could touch on the portfolio alignment as well.
Sure. Thank you, Nagamura-san. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Yasu Iwanaga of Amundi Japan. I'm a Chief Responsible Investment Officer at the local entity. And it's quite sort of honor to be here. And in response to Nagamura-san's questions, let me start first with the industry-wise movement in the recent past. Come to think, since last year, we've seen an enormous movement toward alignment to the net zero goal in the industry, and namely net zero asset managers initiative. And so we are sort of pretty much aligned to change our behaviors or align ourselves to the goal. And the pledging is one thing, and it involves the actually taking actions that Sugano-san explained in the previous sessions. So it's about, first of all, coming up with internal goals. Secondly, being accountable or ensuring the effective communication to end investors, and also trying to develop the net zero products as needs be. So those are sort of kind of they are on our to-do list going forward. And by the way, Amundi has joined the initiative or movement in July. And moving on to a sort of company-specific undertaking or sort of effort-making, like Becky has briefly mentioned on the portfolio alignment, and one of which is ITR, implied temperature rise. And we believe that this is a sort of one of the good addition to sort of metrics we use for climate strategy, because if you take the carbon intensity or absolute emission amounts, they just give you a snapshot or sort of backward-looking view. And what we believe is also important is a forward-looking view, like the trajectories of the individual companies, invested companies, as well as evaluation of their sort of the projects, like temperature rise. And Amundi has recently adopted a new metric, which is forward-looking, and we call the temperature scores. And we use them to define portfolio universe, for example, and also monitor the status of a portfolio to see whether they are or our investments are sort of in line with what we are trying to achieve. This is about the portfolio construction or portfolio monitoring. The other thing is coming up with an investment scheme or investment program for working closely with the asset owners. And one example is fixed income framework that we developed with an Asian institutional investor. So the idea here is to try expand the investable universe above and beyond the green bonds, which is certified in accordance with the ICMA's principle. The more companies report their climate risks or strategies, we believe that the greater our invisible universe would be. And so the framework is designed to examine the individual company's behavior and their future plans in relation to climate risks. That's the second point. And thirdly, engagement. Like the presenters at the previous panel session touched on, we also believe that divesting is the last option. So we believe that we have to explore the win-win solution where possible through reaching out the invested companies, on a standalone basis or jointly. And Amundi has had 472 meetings or 472 engagement with regards to climate change or transition. And also, we use proxy voting as a another tool. And we voted for, with supportive vote, for about 86% of shareholders' resolutions last year. So as such, we're trying to align ourselves and as a user of disclosure, climate disclosure, and we hope that we see more of a iteration between the investors or asset managers like us and the corporates, so that we will be better achieve their target going forward.
Thank you very much, Iwanaga-san. That was very informative. I think I'm not the only person who were relieved to hear about your comments. You mentioned that the portfolio alignment tool is not the only tool that investors use in identifying and evaluating the risk of climate. But I think it is also imperative to investees that investors are starting to use portfolio as a strong tool to measure the impact of climate change. So it's very important that investees keep watching the development of such activities. Thank you very much. So let me change the focus to the increasingly active discussions on disclosure standard setting. Let me seek Becky's comment on how the IFRS Foundation's proposed establishment of the ISSB is related to the TCFD's framework, and how the prototype developed by the leading standard setters will be treated in this process. Becky, can we hear from you?
Yes. So I think the exciting thing is that there's a lot happening in the climate-related disclosure space. And what we had really seen at the beginning of this effort was a proliferation of organizations that were each tackling an aspect of the problem. And what we've seen this past year is really a convergence as companies ask for more consistent guidance and as jurisdictions begin to mandate climate-related disclosures. And as you mentioned, the alliance work that started with the prototype where it brought together the 5 ESG standard setters to develop their path forward, as well as the incorporation of that work into the IFRS standard is a great example of that. Global convergence in the applicability of sustainability reporting standards will help realize one of the primary reasons for the creation of the task force, which was to improve consistency and comparability of climate-related financial information for use by investors, lenders, and underwriters. What I'm excited to see at the ISSB level is that it's bringing together the IFRS Foundation, the International Accounting Standards Board, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the Value Reporting Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and the TCFD into one working group to ensure that the new board builds upon the work that has been done to date and doesn't recreate the wheel on stuff that has already been well established. So there's a lot of cooperation at the working group level to ensure that what comes out of the IFRS efforts incorporates all of the work that has come before and continues to meet industry needs for more consistent guidance. So the TCFD Secretariat, as well as the task force, looks forward to continuing to support the IFRS as it develops the ISSB, as well as to support various jurisdictional efforts on climate-related reporting.
Thank you, Vicky. That was extremely helpful. I think that's an area which is not very much visible to many audience. So I think many people took it as a very insightful advice. So that prompts me to ask Ikeda-san about how Japan stands in response to the shift in standard setting platform that involves climate-related disclosures. Ikeda-san, may I have your comments on this?
Thank you, Nagamura-san, for that question again. Well, certainly the IFRS Foundation's entry into this field is a kind of game changer, I have to say. And the Group of Five and TCFD have been working together to create a certain global converged standard for the climate-related disclosure. And I believe the IFRS Foundation itself will create ISSB, and then that board will collaborate with those stakeholders to come up with a certain global baseline for the climate-related disclosure. But that is not totally, that is actually a good news for Japan. And we've been working together with the IFRS Foundation and established a very collaborative relationship with them. And actually, in Japan, we have a certain coordination mechanism for IFRS Foundation-related matters on not only the sustainability issue, but other more technical issues. And I would say that the IFRS itself is applicable in Japan. So it is accepted as a reporting standard for the Japanese corporation listed in the stock exchange and make a certain public issuance. So if the international sustainability reporting standards comes harmoniously with the IFRS itself, that will certainly create a very good harmonious combination of financial issues and sustainability issues, and that would merge into the full picture of the prospect of the corporate value itself. So we certainly support the overall move by IFRS Foundations to establish the ISSB, and through that process, because some jurisdiction may want to go further than that, but even with that, some jurisdictions move, we can have a certain consistent and comparable global baseline for climate-related disclosure. And for realizing that, Japan is very much looking forward to contributing to that discussion through IFRS Foundation and also IOSCO, the securities regulators organization, also helps that facilitate that discussion with a view to potentially endorsing the ISSB's standards on climate as a cross-border security issuance disclosure standards. So, through IOSCO, but Japan FSA also work very closely with our fellow regulators. So, the overall IFRS Foundation's move is certainly a positive development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ikeda-san, for your description on how Japan is well positioned to keep pace with the global developments. Appreciate that. So with all the tectonic shift in progress, let me get back to the very fundamental question of why we are working so hard on TCFD disclosures. I would like to turn to Tsuda-san again on this point. Given all the requirements to disclose more, I can imagine how tough it must have been to communicate it internally with your colleagues. I'm interested in knowing what values Hitachi finds in disclosing in accordance with the TCFD recommendations. May I solicit your candid comments on the benefits you find in disclosing, or any propositions you may have in making TCFD disclosures more decision useful?
Yes, thank you, Nagamura-san. I try to be candid. So the process requires a significant amount of work, but at the same time, we see benefits. Through internal communications, there has been increased interest in climate change at all levels of the company. So, in the discussion of risk and opportunities with each business unit, we were able to involve not only the person in charge of the environment, but also those in the corporate planning section in charge of a long-term strategy and top management as well. Also, another benefit is that conversations with investors have become easier by using the framework, as Ikeda-san mentioned, constructive dialogue. So at the same time, but we recognize the challenge how to express our contribution to climate change. For example, no matter how much you sell environmentally friendly electrical products, the more products you sell, the more emissions in your reported Scope 3. And if you provide digital solutions and systems, for example, which decrease movement of people and goods, which leads to a CO2 reduction, it has almost nothing to do with your Scope 3 emissions. If you provide an energy system which enables efficient transmission and large-scale integration of renewable energy, the effect is in power conversion factors improvement, but rather diluted. So we believe that disclosure of total amount of Scope 1, 2, and 3 does not provide enough explanation on our contribution to climate change. Currently, the IEC, International Electrotechnical Commission, have just started talking about the standardization of reduction contributions under the initiative of Japan. So Green Investment Guidance 2.0, just published today, also refers to the importance of comprehensive evaluation that takes into account the amount of reduction contribution in addition to Scope 3 emissions. So through these efforts, we hope that all our stakeholders, including investors, understand more on how each company contributes to climate change by reducing CO2 emissions in society as a whole. There is no single solution, and we would like to continue sincere communication for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsuda-san. You brought up a very interesting discussion. I recall that Japanese manufacturing sectors were eager to have the TCFD incorporate avoided emissions in its recommended disclosures. And so it was embedded in its 2017 recommendations. And I was very encouraged to hear that the discussion is taking place at a forum such as the International Electrotechnical Commission, which is something new to me, but that sounds like something worth watching, the developments. So let me ask Iwanaga-san again, if you have any thoughts on how the standard setting discussions should develop from here, and how corporates are expected to respond to this massive shift. And if you could also touch on the points Tsuda-san has raised, it would be terrific.
Okay, thank you, Nagamura-san. Well, like we discussed, we are sort of kind of agreeing that, well, there's no silver point when it comes to understanding the company's climate strategy. No one single metric can help. So therefore, we have to sort of look at the multiple figures or numbers so that we can evaluate how corporates are sort of working on the climate issue holistically as much as possible. Okay, and when it comes to, I would say, sort of a standard setting, it'll be sort of it'll involve lots of iterations or trials and errors. And but I think important thing is TCFD was a relatively new concept to sort of a couple of years ago. Then we sort of took on it. We tried to own it when it comes as we disclose the business outcomes or as a users interpret them. And as we go down the path, we have learned how we should use those pieces of information embedded in those figures or comments, and then we also sort of found out the areas for improvement. So I would say the process continues forever, right, till we reach the sort of our goal. And talking specifically about the avoided emissions, well, if you are an active manager, in particular in equity, you like to understand the value creation process. And if it is the case, you really have to have a sort of better insight vis-a-vis the invested companies' plan going forward and how they believe or how they're trying to create values using their capabilities. That's where avoided emissions comes into picture. I would say Tsuda-san's case is the best example, and I would say there are sort of other companies, in particular, capital goods sector, who are kind of struggling to express or present their sort of performance. And again, if they are material or pretty much relevant to value creation process, we would love to sort of hear their stories with the numbers embedded. That's my view.
Well, thank you very much. So I think we still have one more, still have time to ask one more question to Becky. And for Becky, I'd like to ask, what is the future plan for the TCFD, and how can the business community in Japan or elsewhere in the world be involved in the standard-setting discussions in the coming days? Obviously, we have, as Tsuda-san mentioned earlier, we have a new agenda that we'd like to bring it to the attention of the TCFD. But if you can let us know how we can make such a voice heard, I would appreciate it.
Absolutely. The first thing I would say is just how much we appreciate at the TCFD the voices that Japanese companies provided in the consultation. So we were really encouraged to see broad international participation in the guidance, which improved the final language a lot. And some of these things that we've heard today on the panel around the challenges of scope 3 information and how Hitachi is working to make sure it's capturing, truly its contribution to society rather than just focusing on an absolute number, that's very valuable feedback as well. And Amundi's point around making sure there's a win-win solution with invested companies so that you're not divesting, but rather, leading portfolio alignment in a way that's benefiting both the investees and the investors is another excellent point. So I think that type of feedback that we heard in the consultation was extremely valuable to us. And I would just encourage the Japanese business community to keep responding to these consultations as they come up. I know that there have been a lot that have been put out both by the task force and by others in this space recently. And I'm sure companies are, also looking a bit for a break from these long-winded consultations. But just from the perspective of the Secretariat, we received, over 1,500 open responses across the 200 respondents that participated in the survey. And those were incredibly valuable for improving the final guidance. So I just wanted to leave this audience today with the message that type of response really matters and is critical to getting these standards right. And so I just encourage you to keep participating in those consultations and in that standard setting process as it comes up. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Becky. And so that helps me wrap up the discussion very positively. Allow me to take a moment to summarize what we have discussed over the past 50 minutes. The TCFD is about to publish its revised annex, which incorporates renewed metrics and targets. Disclosure of Scope 3 emissions is seen as an essential element in managing emission reduction in the entire supply chain. That said, the evaluation of Scope 3 emissions is not a simple practice, and its materiality differs substantially depending on the type of business. That is why both sides of the investment spectrum are called to communicate with each other on the background and necessity to disclose Scope 3 emissions, while working together to develop a mutually satisfiable evaluation methodology. Along with Scope 3 emission disclosures, there is an increasing level of interest in measuring and disclosing avoided greenhouse gas emissions. We heard that several industry-led initiatives are developing standards pertaining to the measurement of avoided greenhouse gas emissions. As a growing number of countries are making climate-related disclosures a mandatory practice, the number of TCFD supporters are likely to increase, and at the same time, the comparability of disclosure information are expected to improve. However, flexibility in the disclosure practices should be maintained so that motivated companies can freely showcase how they manage climate-related risks and make the most of their opportunities. All stakeholders in Japan or wherever domiciled are invited to share the experience of disclosure and actively take part in the international dialogue to improve the decision usefulness of TCFD disclosures. With that, I conclude the session. Thanks to all of you for your participation, and please join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent contribution with a big round of virtual applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nagamura and panelists. Thank you very much. Now, after 5 minutes break, Keynote 3 and panel discussion 3 will start. Participants online, please go back to the timeline and join the next session, Keynote 3 and panel discussion 3.